The first thing I noticed when I entered the library was the smell. It wasn't the familiar scent of old books or yellowed paper. There was something more to it, something damp, almost moldy, as if the place itself was slowly breathing, absorbing time and the secrets it kept. I was hired to work there when I was 22, an opportunity that seemed irresistible at the time. The library was located in the city center, but its exact location seemed to slip away from my memory whenever I tried to think about it at night. The building, a stone and glass structure, looked like a place that had withstood time, but at the same time, there was something unsettling about its design, as if it had been built to protect something or to hide it. The inside of the library was dark, with narrow hallways and shelves that reached all the way to the ceiling. As I walked through the aisles, the books seemed to be watching me, their worn spines almost as if they'd been handled by hands from another era. There wasn't much activity during the day, just a few solitary visitors and older staff members who rarely spoke. Everything felt immersed in an unusual silence, as if the place was somehow out of sync with the world outside. It was during my first week of work that I met the head librarian, an elderly man with a long white beard that covered most of his face. He handed me a small notebook and told me, with such grave seriousness that I couldn't tell if it was a joke or a warning, "There are 5 rules you need to follow here. They're for your safety and ours, even though they might not make sense. If you follow them, you'll be safe. If you don't, well, I hope you make good use of your last chance." I laughed, thinking he was just testing me, maybe making some kind of joke. But he didn't smile. His gaze deepened, and the silence around us grew heavier, denser. He handed me the 5 rules, written in a hurried handwriting, almost as if he was trying to get rid of them as quickly as possible. Never look at the empty books. Never speak to the readers after 7 p.m. If you hear something coming from inside a book, close it immediately. Never touch the shelves at night. If a shelf moves toward you, don't follow it. At first, I thought it was just some old superstition or maybe part of some strange code of conduct. But as the days went by, the rules started to arrange themselves in my mind in a disturbing way. Something wasn't right in the library, and I could feel it in my bones. I wasn't sure if it was the constant darkness, the deafening silence, or if it was just my nerves starting to betray me. Either way, I was there to work, and like any new employee, I decided to ignore the librarian's warnings. After all, it was just a library, right? Just books, shelves, and the unmistakable smell of yellowed pages. What could possibly happen? But somewhere deep in the back of my mind, a subtle unease began to grow. I should have paid more attention. I should have listened. In the early days, the library felt like a labyrinth that I was starting to learn to navigate. It was easy to get lost in the dusty hallways, where the shelves seemed to stretch endlessly, and the ancient walls had secrets that would never be revealed. I got used to the routine. The few visitors that came were quiet, as if they didn't want to disturb the almost oppressive calm of the place. But the library, in some way, was watching me. That's what it felt like. Every time I passed by a shelf, every time I looked at a book, it seemed like something moved in the shadows, something that shouldn't be there. It was on my 3rd day at work that I first encountered the rule the head librarian had given me. I was straightening some shelves on the upper floor when I noticed that one book was out of place. It was open, spread across the table, with the cover face down, as if someone had just used it. Without thinking too much, I moved closer to put it back in its proper spot, but something stopped me. There was something strange about that book. The cover was blank, without a title, as if it didn't exist. When I looked closer, I noticed there was nothing inside either. The book was just a blank cover with blank pages. And yet, I felt like I was being drawn to it. The first rule of the librarian echoed in my mind. Never look at the empty books. I should have closed that book and left it where it was. I knew that. The warning echoed in my mind. But instead, I felt a strange compulsion to look closer. It was as if the book was calling my name, as if it was trying to tell me something. The whispers started, faint in the back of my mind, like a distant murmur, but impossible to ignore. I found myself drawn to the table, sitting in the chair in front of the book. My fingers began to tremble as I touched the blank pages. But as I turned the first page, something changed. The air around me seemed to cool, as if the temperature had suddenly dropped. I looked around the hallways, but I was alone, or so I thought. There were no visitors nearby, and the silence was heavier than ever. Then something happened. The pages began to move. It wasn't the wind. There was no one near the window. The pages turned by themselves, one by one, with a soft, almost hissing sound. But they weren't blank pages anymore. I could see something starting to form on them, letters appearing at a terrifying speed, as if the book were writing something in real time. The words seemed to form sentences in a language I didn't recognize, but still, something was there. Something was being revealed. My heart raced faster. I knew I was disobeying the first rule, and the feeling of doing something wrong wrapped around me tighter with each passing second. The words began to take shape, and then a sentence appeared, glowing in dark letters. You shouldn't have looked. I spun the chair to leave the table. But before I could get up, a presence materialized behind me. The sensation was indescribable. Like a pressure in the air, a feeling of being watched by something beyond human comprehension. The book, now closed, lay in front of me as if it had become denser, heavier, with a presence that seemed to crawl through the library, surrounding me. I knew I had made a mistake, but in that moment, I didn't realize how serious that mistake truly was. The next night, something was different. I woke up in my bed, drenched in cold sweat, my heart pounding out of control. The feeling that something was there, watching me, seemed to linger even after I had left the library. That presence stayed, like an invisible weight on my shoulders. The events of the previous day were hazy, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The empty book, the words that had appeared on the pages, the feeling of being followed. It all seemed so distant, as if it had happened in another life. But the fear didn't dissipate. I decided to go back to work, convinced I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong in that library. What should have been a simple task was turning into something strange, something impossible to ignore. When I arrived at the library that morning, the atmosphere was even heavier. The silence seemed to have deepened, as if the walls were slowly closing in, pressing everything around them. The shadows were longer, denser, as if the very place itself was expanding beyond the boundaries of reality. And that's when the second rule appeared in my mind, clearer than ever. Never speak to the readers after 7 p.m. I had no idea how this rule applied to me, but part of me, a more instinctive part, already felt like I needed to follow it. The day passed slowly, until the clock struck 6:45 p.m. I was alone, organizing a shelf in the old books section, when a figure entered through the front door. The glass door creaked as it opened, and a woman stepped inside silently, wearing a black coat that trailed on the floor. She seemed out of place, as if she had appeared out of nowhere, making no sound at all. She moved with a disturbing calmness, her footsteps echoing through the library's silent walls. She didn't look at me immediately. She just walked toward the shelves, her eyes fixed on some distant point. Something about her unsettled me, but it wasn't just her presence. It was as if she was waiting for something. I felt a weight in the air, a sense that something was about to happen. I knew that if she came closer, it would be hard not to speak to her. What would happen if I violated the second rule? I was distracted by a sound, a soft tap, as if someone were gently tapping something on the table behind me. I turned quickly, and that's when I saw it. On the table, an open book. It was the same empty book, but now it was there in my hands, as if it had been placed there on purpose. My fingers, almost on their own, touched the pages, and the book, as though it had a mind of its own, began turning its pages, revealing more words. I looked back at the woman. She was still by the shelf, but something was wrong. Her eyes now were fixed on me, watching me with an intensity one couldn't understand. She wasn't distant anymore. She was there, beside me, and she hadn't made a sound while approaching. I opened my mouth to ask if she needed help, but before the words could leave my mouth, the woman said in a low, almost inaudible voice, "You know you're not supposed to speak to me, don't you?" Her words cut through the air like a blade. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what she meant, but the fear was palpable. The pressure in the air intensified, and that's when the clock, somewhere behind me, began to chime. It was 7 p.m. The library became even quieter, and I could feel the change in the atmosphere, something transforming. The woman smiled, a strange smile, as if she had been waiting for that moment. She didn't speak again, but her gaze remained fixed on me, as I felt my body move involuntarily. I was trapped. I couldn't look away from her. I couldn't leave. Everything was in a deafening silence. And then, suddenly, I understood. The second rule wasn't just about interacting with the readers after 7 p.m. It was about what happened when time became distorted. Something wasn't right with the woman. Something wasn't right with the time, with the library, and maybe I should have paid more attention to the rules. She moved closer, and before I could react, the world around me seemed to tremble, as if space itself were folding. The library, the corridors, the books. Everything seemed to be collapsing, but at the same time remained untouched, as if an invisible force was trying to swallow me whole. And then, before I could do anything, the woman vanished, leaving behind a silence that suffocated me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The feeling of having violated something fundamental was eating away at me from the inside, like an invisible mark that would follow me forever. The incident with the woman, the library distorting around me, the deep silence. Everything felt like part of a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Fear didn't leave me. It seeped into every thought, every movement. But despite everything, something inside me still tried to understand what was happening. I knew there was more. Something was being hidden, and the rules of the library, those strange rules, were the key to understanding what was really at stake. The sun had barely set when I arrived for my shift again. The hallways were quieter than ever, and the faint light from the lamps flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. It was as if the library had become a conscious being, watching every step I took. That's when the third rule appeared in my mind, clearer than ever. Never touch the old books at midnight. I'd heard about these books, of course. They said they were harmless, just curiosities from a past era with no real value. But the fear that gripped me at the thought of touching them was deep. Something inside me told me these books weren't normal, that they held more than just faded words on yellowed pages. It was almost midnight when, involuntarily, my eyes were drawn to the shelf of old books. One of them was out of place, as if it had been waiting for me. The book had a dark leather cover, worn by time. Its title was engraved in gold, but the letters were faded, as if the title itself had been erased by something much older than the book itself. I knew I should turn back. I knew I should follow the rule, but an irresistible force pulled me toward the book. My body seemed to act on its own, as if the fear had been replaced by a need to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. I reached out, touched the cover, and when my fingers made contact, A wave of cold surrounded me. I froze, my eyes fixed on the words. The air around me seemed to chill even more. A sharp pain shot through my head, and the feeling of being pulled into the book intensified. I wanted to stop. I wanted to close the book and run, but my hands wouldn't respond. The words began to move faster until they became a blur, a jumble of letters that merged into something incomprehensible. But there was a sense of foreboding, a feeling that something was getting closer to me, something I couldn't escape anymore. When I finally managed to close the book, silence returned with a loud, agonizing snap, as if something had been broken. The air grew heavy, and the shadows in the corners of the library seemed to grow even more, as if an invisible presence was drawing near. I knew that by touching that book, I had done something irreversible. The rule had been broken, and I was about to find out what that meant. The last thing I saw before the lights went out was a reflection of something on the glass of the shelf, something that hadn't been there before. It was a face, dark and distorted, its eyes fixed on me, and it wasn't in the reflection of the glass. It was behind me. I froze. The reflection of the face behind me seemed impossible. The glass of the shelf reflected a figure with empty eyes, pale, stretched skin, like something that shouldn't exist. The sensation of being watched hit me with painful intensity, as if that being was inside my head, touching my brain with its invisible claws. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. The mere act of looking back felt like signing my own death sentence, a decision that would lead to something I wouldn't understand or control. The silence in the library was broken by a distant sound, as if something was crawling across the wooden floor, slowly drawing closer. I breathed heavily, trying not to succumb to panic, trying to remember anything that would help me escape that feeling. That's when I remembered the fourth rule, the one I had ignored at the beginning, but which now made sense in a way that chilled me to the bone. The fourth rule said, when you feel like you're being watched, look ahead and never look back. I knew I had to follow this rule, that it was the only way to avoid the worst. The problem was curiosity, that treacherous force, was consuming me. The reflection, the empty eyes, the strange presence behind me. Something told me I needed to see it. I needed to understand what was there. But at the same time, a voice inside me, weaker now, was pleading for me not to do it, not to look. The sound of claws scraping the floor grew louder and louder. I could feel the weight of something on my back, something invisible but absolutely real. My breathing became more labored. The anguish gripped my chest. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to gather the strength to follow the rule. Look ahead, look ahead, I whispered to myself, like a mantra. With a tremendous effort, I turned my head, pulling my gaze away from the reflection, trying to focus on the hallway in front of me, where the faint glow of the flickering lights barely illuminated the space. Every inch of the library seemed to be watching me, consuming me with its darkness. The air was thick and heavy, as if the library itself was against me. The crawling sound stopped abruptly. Absolute silence. I stood frozen, listening to my own heartbeat in my chest, until the darkness became almost tangible. Something, or someone, was there. I could feel it. I didn't dare look back. I followed the rule. I stared fixedly at the hallway ahead of me, but in the back of my mind, a question began to form. What's behind me? I made a risky decision. I began to walk slowly, as quietly as possible, trying to reach the library's door. My feet moved heavily, as if each step was an act of courage. But just as I was about to turn the corner toward the main hallway, something interrupted my movement. A voice, low, raspy, almost a whisper. It wasn't a human voice. It was as if someone or something had infiltrated my very thoughts. You can't escape. It was at that exact moment that something made me stop. A presence, stronger than before, invaded my space. The feeling of being watched became unbearable. I was being hunted, and I knew that this time there were no more rules to save me. Suddenly, a strange cold breeze passed by me, coming from the opposite direction. Something was approaching with slow, heavy steps. Something was here, and it was no longer invisible. And then I heard it, the sound of laughter. It wasn't human. It was distorted, as if it was being forced out of a throat that wasn't human. The laughter echoed down the hallway, accompanied by an incomprehensible whisper. I couldn't resist any longer. My body turned instinctively. The reflection, that face I feared, was now there, closer than ever. I finally saw the features of who or what was behind me. It was a tall, skeletal figure with black, deep eyes like two empty holes. Its skin, or what was left of it, was covered in a viscous substance, as if it were decomposing right before my eyes. And its mouth was twisted, in a grotesque expression of a smile that made no sense, as if something were trapped there, struggling to break free. The figure didn't speak, but its eyes seemed to absorb me completely. And then, impossibly, it reached its hand toward me. I screamed, and, as an instinctive reaction, I ran, with every ounce of strength I had left, toward the library exit, not daring to look back. I knew that at any moment, that hand could reach me. But when I reached the door, something made me hesitate. The fifth and final rule came to my mind with chilling clarity. When you try to leave, the library will never allow it. I was trapped. The door was right in front of me, the exit from the library, the freedom I so desperately wanted. But the simple act of touching it made me tremble. The warning of the fifth rule wasn't just a theory. It was real. The library wouldn't let me leave. Something inside me knew that, a sense of inevitability, as if the very act of trying to escape had already sealed my fate. With my hand outstretched, I touched the cold iron of the doorknob. The sound of the metal creaking sliced through the heavy silence, and for a moment, everything seemed suspended. I was so close. My mind screamed for me not to do this, to be cautious, but the desperate need to get out pushed me forward. When I finally turned the doorknob, what I expected happened. The door didn't open. My heart raced. I tried again, with more force this time, pushing the doorknob down. Nothing. It was locked, or something else was preventing my escape. A feeling of oppression overtook me, and for a moment, I thought the library itself was breathing, as if it had a life of its own, feeding on my fear. Desperate, I looked back. I couldn't help it. The reflection of the figure on the shelf was there again, closer, its eyes staring at me with a deadly intensity. The smile stretching across its skeletal face seemed to expand, as if feeding on my anguish. I knew I should follow the rule, not look back, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling that the entity was getting closer with every second, as if it were surrounding me. I needed to understand what was happening. That's when I noticed a movement. Something was crawling along the shelves, through the dark corridor. A shadow stretched across the floor, a sinister figure with shapes that couldn't be described. It was as if the bookshelves were bending, deforming, to allow something through, something that moved, but not in a natural way. Suddenly, the sound of claws scraping the wood returned, closer, closer than ever. The cold sensation took over me. The air was thick, almost unbearable. I felt a pressure on my shoulders, as if invisible hands were holding me, preventing me from making any movement beyond that small space. And then I heard a voice, low and almost inaudible, coming from behind me. It wasn't a human voice, but something deeper, something that shouldn't have been heard. You tried to escape. Now, you will never leave. It was the library speaking to me, or rather, something within it. The library was more than just a place. It was an entity, a presence that had the power to trap the soul of anyone who dared disobey its rules. My hands began to shake. The doorknob, which had once felt solid, was now hot to the touch, as if it were alive. I knew that if I insisted on trying to open the door, the situation would get even worse. It was as if the library itself was reacting, closing in around me. What I didn't know was that I had already crossed the point of no return. The library was consuming me, with panic rising, I tried to take a step back, trying to find another exit, another way out. But when I looked at the dark corridor ahead of me, the bookshelf seemed to stretch beyond what I could see, forming a maze of corridors and passages that closed off as I tried to go through them. I was trapped. I had ignored the rules, and now the library wouldn't let me leave. Every book on the shelves seemed to be watching me, as if the eyes on the pages were following my every move. Each shelf, each row, was moving at a slow and sinister rhythm, with books falling randomly from their places, making popping and scratching noises. That's when I realized the rules weren't just a way to avoid evil. They were a way to maintain balance within the library. And now that the balance had been broken, I was at the mercy of its will. The library had already marked me, and the worst part was that I wasn't alone. Something else was there, watching, waiting for the right moment to claim me. Something that shouldn't exist. Something the library itself had created to protect its darkest secrets. As the ground trembled beneath my feet and the shadows stretched out, I realized the truth. The fifth rule wasn't about escaping the library. It was about not letting it escape from you. And now, I was part of it. The library, now alive, seemed to breathe with renewed fury. The shelves closed around me like an invisible prison, and the sound of something crawling through the shadows grew louder, closer. I didn't know how much time had passed, whether hours or days, but I knew I was beyond salvation. I had been marked, not only by the library, but by the very essence of the evil it contained. Every book it housed wasn't just a record of words, but a vessel for lost souls, for creatures that fed on curiosity and despair. They were waiting for me, waiting to consume me, to make me yet another page in the library's macabre history. The last thing I realized before I was consumed by darkness was that the reflection of the skeletal figure on the shelf had disappeared, but its presence remained, as if it had merged with me, with the place. I was no longer a person. I had become a part of the library. With every moment, with every breath, I became another book, another forgotten story in the shadows. And then everything went silent. The sounds of the library quieted. The labyrinth of shelves closed. I was trapped in its eternal darkness, and somehow, I knew that my story, the story of my fall, would now become another legend for those who dared to follow the rules, or break them, because in the library, curiosity is never punished until it becomes an endless nightmare.